this is going to be on tips for rebuttals, right? But it's slightly awkward because we were supposed to cover the back half of around like the summaries and the rebuttals, etc. Today, but we skipped that for the practice round, so some of it might seem slightly out of context. I'll just try to explain it now, I guess. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a very brief PowerPoint presentation prepared. And no, I don't want to do that right now. Hang on. I need to actually open it right now. Screen. Everyone see my screen? Okay, cool. So tips for rebuttals. So what we're originally going to cover in the next couple of classes, so what I mean by back half is we're going to talk about the specific public forum format of the rebuttals, how a summary looks, what a summary looks like, what a final focus looks like. And that lecture is going to go over general strategic choices and the overall goals and objectives that you should be looking at in these final speeches, and basically how they're differing from the original constructives. I'm not going to get too in-depth into that because I don't want to steal the back half lecture away. So just keep that in mind, that this lecture is not going to be about those general strategic choices and what like a whole rebuttal constructive looks like. This is going to be very specific about the formula of a rebuttal, which I'm going to get to now. So we're looking at inside a rebuttal, and this is a very generic formula that you can apply across any rebuttal. It's not specific to one speech, one format. It's a general kind of refutation formula, like I mentioned before. And this is actually taught to me by one of my other teachers from last summer. So I definitely can't claim credit for it. This is not my original formula. So what I'm going to teach you right now is what we also like to call line by line, in which you address every single individual point made in the previous speech by your opponent. And this is especially important in the second speeches, which is basically the bulk of the rebuttals. It's where you first start giving your new answers to the original constructives. And like I mentioned before, it's a generic formula regardless of the actual speech. Okay, so this is the formula. Again, not mine. It's one of the teachers that I had that gave our entire class kind of this formula. So there's 4 points that you should be making in your rebuttal. The first one is extend, then answer, then compare, and then more. Extend, answer, compare, more. That is the generic formula. So I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit for you. The first point is extend. So what they mean by that is you're going to be extending whatever argument you originally made that kind of helps you against the new argument your opponent made. So this is an argument that's already introduced in the constructive. It's not new. It's something that you already laid out for the judge. And this is just a general overall analytic explanation of what does this mean. The second one is where you're actually going to answer your opponent's argument. So this is where you're going to give kind of an analytic or an analysis of why their card or their evidence or their reasoning in general is just wrong. And this can take shape in a multitude of different ways. It really depends on the specific argument that your opponents are making, but I'll give some examples at the end of this section of the slideshow. The third thing you're going to do is compare. So by compare, we mean comparing evidence. So you're going to want to compare your original evidence, the one that you're extending, to their evidence, the one that they use to answer your argument. So evidence comparison can look like comparing author reliability. It can look at comparing the bias associated with the publisher. It can be in comparing the date. It can be in comparing the actual context of the card and the context that yours are in. So there's a lot of different ways that you can compare evidence. A note for this is that comparison of evidence is not limited to just the author or just the date, right? You can also actually look inside the card specifically and see, well, they're obviously reading the wrong thing, or my opponent mistagged it, etc., etc. And then the more section is when you're going to want to add new cards on. So in your rebuttal, this is the area where you would put new evidence on. You can put any new evidence that you think would help your argument or help answer your opponent's argument. Now, the thing about this formula is kind of that you don't necessarily need to always add cards to just answer, right? So for example, in this answer section, if you feel like you don't need a card or it's easier to just answer with an analytic, sometimes it is better to just have a very smart, efficient analytic that can quickly answer it rather than reading an entire card. So a lot of times in rounds, we do see that people, when they see an argument, for example, they're trying to respond to it, they just read one card and then they move on. So in your first two constructives, yes, you can do that, but eventually as you get closer to the final speeches, you're going to want to do kind of more analytics, more of your own reasoning, more of these like smart analytics, which I know I kind of already said before, but just repeating that. And then your more is for your new cards. Yeah, so are there any questions on this general formula that haven't already been answered in the chat? Okay, cool. So this is my example. So let's say that their argument, so my opponent's argument is that US hegemony is bad. And I'm trying to say that US hegemony is good for a multitude of reasons. So following the 4-point formula of extend, answer, compare, and more, I would first extend my original argument, which is that in the 1AC, Brooks, Eckenberry, and Woolforth indicate that only US hegemony is able to stop Allied proliferation or stop our allies from developing their own nuclear weapons and building their arms arsenal, because we're able to provide this kind of nuclear umbrella that makes them feel secure, right? It makes them feel like they don't have to do that because they're already protected by the US. So I'm extending that point, which I already made in my constructive. This isn't a new point. The second thing I would be doing is answering their card. So I would say that their evidence actually has the correlation backwards. They say that, gosh, I can't actually remember the specific card I'm trying to answer right now. Let's say that their evidence says that as hedge was declining, as the US decreased its military force, there was more peace. Then I would say that this correlation is backwards. It's more likely that actually there was peace and therefore the US military started to decline, because we don't really need to have like a strong military if we have a lot of stable peace going on. So I would say their evidence is measuring the wrong thing right now. And that's the reason why your claim is wrong. Then the third thing is comparing my evidence to their evidence. So I would say, for example, our evidence studies historical trends and analyzes the actions of different countries, periods of times, analyzes kind of the culture behind it, etc. But theirs is just making statements, right? So they're just relying on author reliability, but our actual line of reasoning is much more persuasive. So in here, I'm comparing the actual content and substance within a card. I'm not saying that my author is more reliable than the other, although that is a good form of evidence comparison too sometimes. I chose to just look at the substance of the card. So that's evidence comparison. And then 4, I would insert more cards, which I don't have right now. But in an actual round, I would put in more cards that have different warrants and that say why like US hedge is good. And then that is my rebuttal. And then the important thing about this is that this is how you're answering one argument, right? So there's a lot of different arguments made in one speech. And if you are answering them all, you can be following this 4-point formula in every single argument, right? So let's say their next argument is something else, something about how like H-1B visas help the economy. Then I would 4-point it again. And you keep on going downwards like that. There's a lot of organization involved in this as well, because you want to continue going down the flow. Yeah, I said that right. Which will make it a lot more organized and a lot easier for the judges to flow at times. And I don't know if anyone already addressed this in the chat, but another thing to note is that this part of it, the more, is not as crucial as the first 3 points. And especially when you're getting near your last 2 speeches where typically cards are not read, this is optional. That's pretty much the slideshow for me. I can answer questions or do anything else right now pretty much until